hot summer morning in the year 1838, the slave market in Natchez, Mississippi, was already crowded before sunrise. Traders stood beside wooden platforms, shouting prices while wealthy plantation owners inspected rows of enslaved men and women brought from across the South. The smell of dust, sweat, and river mud hung heavy in the air as another day of buying and selling human lives began. Strong men were always the first to attract attention. Plantation owners needed workers who could survive endless hours in the cotton fields under the burning sun. Buyers moved from one person to another, examining shoulders, arms, and backs as if they were studying livestock before an auction. But that morning, something unusual happened. A man was brought forward who immediately stopped the entire market. He was taller than anyone else standing on the platform. His shoulders were massive. His arms looked powerful enough to lift heavy cotton bales without effort. Some witnesses later said he stood nearly 7 feet tall, towering over the traders beside him. At first, the buyers were impressed. Then the whispers began spreading through the crowd. Because owning a man that large created a problem none of the slave masters had ever faced before. It was not the price. It was not the labor. It was transporting him to the plantation. Wagons were built for ordinary men. Chains were designed to control people of average strength. Guards were trained to watch groups. Not a single man who looked powerful enough to break restraints if he ever decided to fight. And suddenly, the strongest man in the slave market became the man no master wanted to risk buying. The traders stared at him in frustration. The buyers stepped back in uncertainty, and the giant stood there in silence, watching the system that claimed to own him struggle to decide what to do next. The trader, who brought him to the market, wiped sweat from his forehead and tried to raise the crowd's excitement again. He climbed onto the wooden platform beside the giant and shouted loudly so the buyers scattered across the square could hear him. He described the man as the strongest field worker he had ever seen. He promised that this single worker could harvest more cotton than 2 ordinary men. He spoke about the strength in the giant's arms and the endurance in his broad chest. The trader insisted that any plantation owner who purchased him would gain a valuable asset capable of years of labor. Yet despite all the promises, the buyers remained cautious. They looked at the giant carefully, not only with curiosity, but also with concern. Some men whispered to one another that moving such a powerful person across long distances could be dangerous. Others wondered how many guards would be required to control him if he ever decided to resist. The giant remained completely still while the arguments continued around him. His wrists were bound with iron restraints, yet the chains looked strangely small against his enormous hands. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd, as if studying every person who examined him. A few buyers stepped forward, walked around him, and measured the width of his shoulders with their eyes. They spoke quietly among themselves, before shaking their heads and stepping away again. Strength normally raised a man's value in the slave market, but in this case, the same strength made buyers nervous. One plantation owner muttered that he did not want a worker who might overpower the overseer. Another worried that if the giant attempted to escape during transport, the guards might not be able to stop him. Minutes turned into nearly an hour, while the traders continued calling for bids. Normally, a strong field worker would be sold within minutes of appearing on the platform. Buyers were eager to secure labor before their competitors could act. But this time, the situation was different. The giant remained unsold while the crowd continued whispering. Even the traders began showing frustration. Every day an enslaved person remained in the market meant additional cost for food, supervision, and lost profit. One trader suggested lowering the price to attract a buyer. Another argued that such strength deserved a high price, and that lowering it would only encourage hesitation. The giant listened quietly as men argued over his value, as if he were nothing more than equipment waiting to be purchased. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat of the Mississippi morning grew stronger. Buyers who had come to purchase workers began completing their deals with other traders. Wagons filled with newly purchased people slowly rolled away from the square as guards led groups toward nearby docks where riverboats waited. Yet the giant remained standing on the platform. The longer he stayed there, the more curious the crowd became. Some buyers returned just to stare again at the man no one seemed willing to take home. The traders knew they had to make a decision soon. If no plantation owner agreed to purchase him that day, they would be forced to move him to another market farther south along the river. But even that plan created another difficult question. How could they safely transport a man whose strength frightened the very buyers who were supposed to control him? The traders gathered beside the platform and began speaking in low voices, while the giant remained standing under the burning Mississippi sun. One of them suggested moving him immediately to the river docks, where transport boats regularly carried enslaved people to plantations along the Mississippi Delta. Another trader quickly disagreed. River transport usually involved long chains connecting several people together, while guards watched from both sides. But this situation was different. The giant was not part of a group. If he resisted or attempted to break free during the journey, the guards would be facing a man far stronger than any worker they had handled before. Some buyers who had lingered nearby began offering their opinions, even though they had already decided not to purchase him. One wealthy planter laughed nervously and said that the giant looked strong enough to snap a wooden wagon axle if he kicked hard enough. Another suggested that 3 or 4 guards might be necessary just to move him safely through town. The traders listened to these comments with growing frustration. Strength had always been an advantage in the slave market, yet here it had become the very reason the giant could not be sold. Meanwhile, the giant remained silent. He stood with his head slightly lowered, while the chains around his wrists clinked softly whenever he shifted his weight. His presence seemed to make the entire square uneasy. People were not used to seeing someone who physically towered above nearly everyone around him. The traders tried once more to attract interest. They called out to the remaining buyers and lowered the asking price slightly, hoping someone might finally decide that the reward outweighed the risk. But the hesitation continued. Several plantation owners admitted openly that they feared what might happen if the giant reached their land and refused to obey orders. Cotton plantations depended heavily on control. Overseers used intimidation and punishment to maintain authority over large groups of workers. Yet controlling a man of this size might require something entirely different. If the giant ever decided to fight back, the overseer could find himself facing a man who might easily overpower him. The traders began realizing something troubling. This man's strength had turned him into a problem rather than a profit. The crowd in the market slowly thinned as buyers completed their business and left with their newly purchased workers. Dust rose from wagon wheels as groups of enslaved people were marched away toward distant plantations. The afternoon sun began casting long shadows across the square. Still, the giant remained unsold. Finally, one trader made a suggestion that changed the conversation. If no buyer in Natchez wanted to take the risk, Perhaps a larger plantation farther south might see things differently. Louisiana plantations often demanded stronger labor for sugarcane fields and heavy mill work. A man of such enormous strength might be useful there. The idea seemed reasonable, but the same problem remained. Transporting him would still require an unusual plan. The traders began discussing how many chains might be necessary, and whether additional guards should accompany the journey downriver. One man suggested placing iron restraints on both his wrists and ankles before moving him. Another recommended building a reinforced wagon specifically for the transport. While they argued, the giant slowly lifted his head and looked toward the river beyond the market. The Mississippi flowed quietly in the distance, carrying boats, goods, and people south toward lands none of them could see from the market square. And for the first time that day, the giant spoke. His voice was calm, deep, and unexpectedly steady. "You fear how to move me," he said. The traders fell silent. The crowd that remained turned their attention toward him, and the giant continued speaking in a way that made the entire market uneasy. "Yet none of you have asked the question that matters most." The traders stared at him cautiously. "What question?" one of them asked. The giant looked directly at the men who had been arguing over his fate all afternoon. "The question," he said quietly, "is whether I intend to go at all." The words hung in the heavy air of the market square. For a moment, no one moved. Slave markets were loud places, filled with shouting traders and bargaining buyers. But suddenly, the entire space felt strangely quiet. The men standing around the platform looked at each other, unsure how to respond. Enslaved people were not supposed to speak during auctions. They were expected to stand silently, while others decided their fate. Yet the giant had spoken calmly, almost thoughtfully, as if he were part of the discussion rather than the object being sold. One of the traders quickly stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. His face tightened with irritation as he grabbed the chain attached to the giant's wrists and pulled it sharply. "You do not decide where you go," the trader snapped loudly. "That decision belongs to the man who buys you." The giant did not resist the pull. He simply looked down at the trader holding the chain, and something about that quiet stare made several men in the crowd shift uncomfortably. The trader cleared his throat and tried again to excite the remaining buyers. "You see the strength in this man," he shouted. "A worker who could harvest more cotton in a single season than most men do in two. Strong enough for timber cutting, river loading, or sugarcane fields. A rare opportunity for anyone brave enough to take it." But the buyers were no longer focused on his words. They were watching the giant. The way he stood calmly, despite the chains. The way his eyes moved slowly across the crowd. The way he had spoken without fear a moment earlier. Strength alone had already made them cautious. Now, his confidence made them uneasy. One older plantation owner stepped closer to the platform and studied the giant carefully. His hair was gray, and his hands were rough from years of managing land along the river. He had purchased many workers over the years, and rarely hesitated when a good laborer appeared in the market. But even he seemed unsure now. He circled the platform once, examining the giant's size from every angle. "Where did you find him?" the planter finally asked the trader. "Upriver," the trader replied quickly. "A shipment from Arkansas Territory. Worked timber before being brought here." The planter nodded slowly. Timber workers often grow strong, he said, but this one looks stronger than most. He paused for a moment, thinking carefully. Then he asked the question that had been lingering in everyone's mind since morning. How many men did it take to bring him here? The trader hesitated. 3 guards, he admitted, and chains. The planter looked back at the giant. And if he chose not to walk? The trader forced a laugh, trying to dismiss the concern. That is why chains exist, he said. But even as he spoke, the planter could see that the iron restraints looked almost too small against the giant's wrists. The buyer stepped back and shook his head slowly. Too much trouble, he muttered before walking away. Another opportunity had vanished. The traders watched the man disappear into the thinning crowd and realized the day was slipping away. The sun was already beginning its slow descent toward the western trees. If they did not sell the giant before evening, they would have to house him overnight and try again the following day. That meant more cost, more guards, more risk. One of the younger traders stepped close to the giant and spoke quietly, almost as if trying to study him. What is your name? He asked. The giant remained silent for several seconds. Finally he answered. Kofi. The trader frowned slightly. Where are you from, Kofi? Farther away than this river can carry you, the giant replied calmly. The answer confused several of the men listening nearby. But the trader did not continue asking questions. Instead, he stepped back and spoke with the other traders again. We cannot keep him here much longer, he said quietly. If buyers in Natchez will not take him, we move him south. Baton Rouge or New Orleans markets are larger. Someone there might risk it. The others nodded. The decision was slowly forming. They would transport the giant down the Mississippi River. Yet, as the traders began making plans, none of them noticed the small change in Kofi's expression. For the first time since arriving in the market, the giant allowed the faintest hint of a smile, because while the traders were busy planning how to move him, Kofi had already begun planning something of his own. The sun was lowering toward the trees when the traders finally made their decision. If the giant could not be sold in Natchez, they would move him farther south along the Mississippi River, where larger slave markets operated. Baton Rouge and New Orleans attracted buyers from plantations across Louisiana and the Deep South. If anyone would be willing to take the risk of purchasing a man like Kofi, it would be there. But preparing to move him required caution. The traders sent for additional iron restraints from a nearby blacksmith. They also hired 2 more guards to accompany the journey. Normally, a small group of enslaved workers could be transported with only 1 or 2 men watching them. This time, the traders wanted no chances. Kofi would travel in chains strong enough to hold him, surrounded by guards who would not take their eyes off him for a moment. As the preparations continued, the market square slowly emptied. Buyers had already left with their purchases, and the remaining traders began packing their equipment for the evening. Wagons creaked as they rolled away from the square, while riverboats blew their whistles in the distance. Kofi remained standing on the platform until the traders finally ordered him down. The iron chains were heavier now, newly tightened around both his wrists and ankles. When he stepped onto the dusty ground, the metal links clanked loudly, drawing the attention of the few people still passing through the square. The guards formed a small circle around him as they began walking toward the river docks. The Mississippi River lay just beyond the market streets, wide and powerful as it carried boats and cargo southward. Wooden docks stretched out into the brown water, where riverboats waited to transport goods and people along the busy trade routes. That evening, one of those boats would carry Kofi away from Natchez. The traders led him down the narrow streets, while curious onlookers paused to stare at the enormous man moving slowly in chains. Children whispered to one another, while merchants leaned out from their doorways to watch the strange procession pass by. Few people had ever seen an enslaved man so large. Fewer still had seen one who looked so calm, despite the heavy restraints. At the dock, a flat riverboat waited beside the wooden pier. The crew had been warned in advance that a difficult prisoner would be arriving. Several men stood ready with ropes and poles, watching carefully as the guards brought Kofi closer. One of the traders stepped onto the boat and spoke with the captain, explaining the situation quickly. "Take him south to Baton Rouge," the trader said. "We will try the market there." The captain nodded, but kept his eyes fixed on the giant. "That man is larger than any cargo I have carried," he muttered quietly. "He is not cargo," the trader replied sharply. "He is property." But even as he said the words, the captain did not look convinced. The guards began guiding Kofi onto the boat. The wooden board creaked beneath his weight as he stepped carefully across the narrow ramp, leading from the dock to the deck. The chains around his ankles forced him to move slowly, yet each step seemed steady and deliberate. Once on board, the guards secured his chains to a heavy iron ring fixed into the deck near the center of the boat. The restraints clanked loudly as they tightened the lock. Kofi lowered himself onto the wooden floor and sat quietly while the guards stepped back. The riverboat whistle sounded a deep echo across the water. Ropes were untied. The boat slowly pushed away from the dock. As the distance between the boat and the shore began to widen, the lights of Natchez flickered faintly along the riverbank. The traders stood watching from the dock as their unusual cargo disappeared into the growing darkness. They believed the problem had finally been solved. Kofi would be sold in another market. Another plantation owner would deal with the risk. But as the riverboat drifted deeper into the Mississippi current, Kofi lifted his eyes toward the dark horizon ahead. The guards believed the chains had solved everything. The traders believed distance would solve the rest. What none of them understood yet was that Kofi had spent the entire day studying something far more important than the market. He had been studying the river. And before that boat reached Baton Rouge, the giant slave no master could transport was about to prove exactly why so many buyers had hesitated to own him. The riverboat moved steadily south through the dark waters of the Mississippi. The sound of the engine and the slow churn of the paddle wheels echoed across the quiet river. Lanterns hung along the sides of the boat, casting dim light across the wooden deck where Kofi sat in chains. The guards remained close. Two men stood only a few steps away, leaning against the railing while watching him carefully. They had been warned that the prisoner was unusually strong, and neither of them intended to underestimate him. Yet, as the hours passed, Kofi did nothing. He sat quietly, with his back against a wooden post, his massive hands resting calmly on the heavy chains around his wrists. From time to time, he lifted his eyes toward the dark water flowing beside the boat, studying the wide river as it carried them farther from Natchez. The guards began to relax. One of them lit a pipe and leaned against a barrel near the railing. The other sat on a wooden crate, occasionally glancing at Kofi, but mostly watching the dim lights of small settlements along the riverbank. To them the giant seemed defeated. After all, what could a chained man possibly do in the middle of a moving riverboat surrounded by guards. But Kofi continued watching the river. The Mississippi was enormous, wide and powerful, as it carried water hundreds of miles toward the Gulf of Mexico. The current moved steadily, and large pieces of driftwood floated silently past the boat. Kofi had spent much of his life near rivers. Long before he had been forced into slavery, water had been part of his world. He understood currents, depth, and the quiet strength of moving water. And now, he was studying the river again. The boat traveled deeper into the night. The lantern light flickered as the river breeze moved across the deck. Several crew members slept near the bow, while others remained awake to guide the boat through the dark waters. Hours passed. The guards grew tired. One of them eventually stood up and stretched his arms. "I do not see why the traders were so worried about him," the man muttered to his partner. "He has not moved since we left Natchez." The other guard shrugged. "Maybe he knows resistance is useless." They both laughed quietly. Behind them, Kofi slowly lifted his head. The boat had moved far from the town now. The riverbanks were darker here, lined with thick trees and silent stretches of wilderness where few people lived. The lanterns along the deck swayed gently as the boat rocked with the current. Kofi shifted his weight slightly. The chains around his wrists clanked softly against the iron ring attached to the deck. One of the guards glanced at him briefly. "Stay still," the guard said lazily. Kofi said nothing. Instead, he looked down at the iron restraints. Earlier that evening, when the blacksmith had tightened the chains, Kofi had noticed something important. The iron links were strong, but the wooden post they were attached to was not. For hours he had been testing the post carefully, moving his weight against it in small, almost invisible motions. Each movement loosened the bolts holding the iron ring in place. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to weaken the wood. Now, in the quiet darkness of the river, Kofi slowly shifted his massive shoulders again. The wood creaked, softly, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. The guards continued their conversation near the railing, their attention drifting away from the chained giant behind them. Kofi leaned forward slightly. The iron chain tightened. The wooden post groaned again. Still, the guards did not notice. Kofi closed his eyes for a moment and breathed slowly. Then, with one powerful movement of his shoulders and arms, he pulled forward with all the strength that had frightened the slave market buyers that morning. The wooden post cracked. The iron ring ripped loose from the deck. The sound echoed across the boat like a gunshot. The guards turned instantly. But by the time they understood what had happened, the giant was already on his feet. The chains still hung from his wrists and ankles. Yet the restraints were no longer attached to the boat. For the first time since leaving the market, Kofi was no longer tied down. The guards reached for their weapons, but the giant was already moving, and the river beside the boat was waiting. The moment the wooden post tore loose from the deck, the quiet night on the river exploded into chaos. The crack of splitting wood echoed across the boat like a rifle shot. One of the guards spun around instantly, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt. The other guard jumped to his feet, staring in disbelief at the giant, now standing free, with broken iron dragging from his wrists. For a second, neither man moved. They had expected resistance, perhaps, shouting, perhaps, but not this sudden burst of power. Kofi stood tall in the lantern light, the broken iron ring still attached to the chain in his hands. The wind from the river moved across the deck, and the lantern flames flickered wildly, as if the night itself had become restless. Then one of the guards shouted, "Stop him!" But Kofi was already moving. Despite the chains still wrapped around his ankles, his strides were powerful. The broken iron ring swung from the chain like a heavy hammer as he moved across the deck. The first guard tried to raise his pistol, but Kofi's massive arm swung forward. The iron ring struck the man's hand with a sharp metallic crack. The pistol flew into the river. The guard staggered backward in pain, clutching his wrist. The second guard lunged forward, attempting to grab the chain around Kofi's shoulders, but the giant twisted his body and pushed the man aside with a single shove. The guard slammed into a stack of cargo crates and collapsed in a tangle of rope and wood. The noise had awakened the crew. Men rushed onto the deck from the lower cabin, shouting in confusion as they saw the enormous figure standing free beneath the lanterns. "Grab him!" someone yelled. But the crew hesitated. The giant looked nothing like the helpless prisoners they usually transported. Even with chains around his wrists and ankles, he looked like a force of nature standing in the middle of the deck. For a moment, the only sound was the river flowing beside the boat. Then Kofi turned toward the railing. The Mississippi stretched wide and dark under the night sky. The current was strong, moving steadily south through the wilderness beyond the towns and plantations. Kofi had been studying that water since the boat left Natchez. He knew exactly what it meant. Freedom was not waiting on the boat. Freedom was waiting in the river. The captain suddenly burst onto the deck with a lantern in one hand. "What is happening here?" he demanded. Then he saw the broken chains, and the giant standing near the railing. "Stop him!" the captain shouted. Several crewmen rushed forward, but they were too late. Kofi climbed onto the wooden railing with a single powerful movement. The chains clattered loudly against the wood as he balanced for a brief moment above the dark water. The crew froze. One man raised a rifle, but the captain grabbed his arm. "Do not shoot!" the captain barked. "If he falls with those chains, the river will take him anyway." Kofi looked down at the rushing current below. The river roared softly in the darkness. Behind him, the men on the deck stood frozen between fear and disbelief. No one had expected this. No one had believed the giant would truly try to escape. Kofi turned his head one last time toward the boat. The lantern light reflected in his eyes. Then, without another word, the giant slave no master could transport leapt from the railing into the Mississippi River. The splash echoed across the dark water. The current swallowed him instantly. The crew rushed to the side of the boat, peering into the darkness. But the river was vast, and the night was deep. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then one of the guards whispered quietly, almost in disbelief, "He is gone." The captain stared into the flowing water. "No," the captain said slowly. "He is free, and somewhere in the powerful current of the Mississippi River, beneath the dark sky of the southern wilderness, the giant named Kofi was already swimming toward a future no slave market would ever control again." The crew remained frozen at the railing, staring into the dark water where the giant had vanished. The Mississippi River moved steadily beneath them, its current carrying pieces of driftwood and small waves past the hull of the boat. Lantern light reflected across the surface, but there was no sign of the man who had jumped moments earlier. One of the guards leaned farther over the railing, trying to see through the darkness. "He cannot survive that," the man muttered. "Not with chains on his legs. Another guard shook his head slowly. "The current will drag him under." The captain remained silent. He had spent most of his life on the Mississippi, guiding boats through storms, floods, and dangerous currents. He knew how powerful the river could be, but he also knew something else. Sometimes the river gave people a chance, and sometimes it carried them farther than anyone expected. "Turn the lanterns toward the water," the captain finally ordered. Several crewmen rushed to obey, lifting the hanging lanterns and aiming the light down toward the river. The glow spread across the dark surface, searching for movement, searching for any sign of the enormous swimmer. But the water revealed nothing, only the endless current moving south. One of the crewmen spoke nervously. "Should we stop the boat?" The captain shook his head. "If we stop now, the current will carry him far ahead of us before we can search properly." The paddle wheels slowed slightly as the crew scanned the water again. Still nothing. Minutes passed. Then one of the younger sailors suddenly pointed toward the far side of the river. "There!" he shouted. Everyone rushed to the railing. For a brief moment, something moved in the dark water near the distant shoreline. A shadow rose above the surface before disappearing again between the waves. The guards squinted into the darkness. "You saw that?" one asked. The sailor nodded quickly. "He is swimming." The guards looked at each other in disbelief. Swimming with chains on his wrists and ankles should have been impossible. The iron alone was heavy enough to drag an ordinary man under the water within seconds. Yet Kofi was not an ordinary man. The captain narrowed his eyes toward the distant movement. "He is heading for the trees," the captain said quietly. Along the far side of the river, the shoreline was thick with forest. Tall cypress and oak trees stretched into the darkness, their branches forming a deep wall of shadows along the water's edge. If Kofi reached that forest, finding him would become nearly impossible. The guards understood this as well. "We should launch a small boat," one of them insisted. "If he reaches land, we will lose him." But the captain hesitated. The Mississippi was wide and the current was strong. Launching a smaller boat at night carried its own dangers. And something about the giant swimmer in the darkness made the captain pause. He watched the water carefully. Another shadow moved near the shoreline. Then the movement stopped. The forest swallowed the figure completely. The guards waited, hoping to see him again. But the river returned to silence. The giant was gone. One of the guards slammed his fist against the railing in frustration. "That man was worth a fortune," he growled. Another shook his head. "Not anymore." The captain turned slowly away from the water. "Set the boat back on course," he ordered calmly. The crew obeyed. The paddle wheels began turning again, pushing the riverboat deeper into the Mississippi night. Behind them, the dark forest remained still. Somewhere within those trees, the giant named Kofi had reached the shore. The chain still hung from his wrists. The iron still weighed down his legs. But the river had carried him beyond the reach of the slave market, and deep inside the wilderness along the Mississippi River, a man who had been treated like property was now moving through the forest as something far more powerful, launched Sartans, a free man. Yet freedom in the wilderness would bring new challenges. Plantations stretched across the land, surrounding the river. Slave catchers often searched the forests for runaways, and patrols traveled the roads looking for anyone who might be hiding. Kofi knew the danger had not ended. It had only begun. But the same strength that had frightened buyers in the slave market would soon become something far more important. Because in the forests beyond the Mississippi River, Kofi was about to discover that he was not the only person hiding from the system that tried to own him. Kofi remained motionless for several minutes after reaching the riverbank. The cold water of the Mississippi dripped from his body as he crouched between the thick roots of a cypress tree. The chains around his wrists and ankles clinked softly whenever he shifted his weight, but the sound was swallowed quickly by the night insects and the slow movement of the river. He listened carefully. Behind him, somewhere out on the water, the riverboat continued moving south. The distant rumble of the paddle wheels slowly faded as the boat disappeared into the darkness. The men aboard would not find him now. The forest along the river was wide and dense, filled with swamps, tangled roots, and narrow animal paths that twisted deep into the wilderness. Still, Kofi knew he could not remain where he was. The iron chains were a problem. Even though they were no longer attached to the boat, the heavy metal around his ankles slowed his movement. If slave catchers came searching along the riverbank in the morning, the tracks from those chains could easily lead them straight to him. Kofi stood slowly and stepped deeper into the forest. Each step required careful balance as the chains dragged across the ground. The mud and wet leaves muffled some of the sound, but he knew the iron would continue slowing him until he found a way to break it. The forest was thick. Tall cypress trees rose from shallow pools of dark water. Moss hung from the branches like gray curtains, and the ground beneath his feet shifted between firm soil and soft swamp. The air smelled of damp wood and river mud. Yet to Kofi, the forest felt familiar. Long before he had been forced into slavery, he had known landscapes like this. Rivers, forests, and open land were not strangers to him. The wilderness did not frighten him the way it frightened many of the men who hunted runaways. The wilderness was alive, and it offered hiding places. After moving through the trees for nearly an hour, Kofi finally reached a small patch of higher ground where the forest floor rose above the swamp water. There he stopped beside a fallen tree trunk and examined the chains more closely in the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. The iron cuffs were thick and tightly closed around his wrists, but the links between them had been weakened when the wooden post tore loose from the boat. Kofi picked up a heavy stone from the ground. Slowly, carefully, he raised the stone and brought it down against the chain. The first strike echoed softly through the trees. Again he lifted the stone. Again the metal rang against the iron links. The work was slow and exhausting, but Kofi continued striking the chain, again and again. Each blow bent the metal slightly farther, until finally one of the links cracked open. The chain around his wrists fell to the ground. For the first time since leaving the slave market, his hands were free. Kofi flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the blood returning to muscles that had been locked in iron for days. The chains around his ankles remained, but with his hands free, he now had a better chance of removing them as well. Before he could begin, however, a faint sound reached his ears. Voices. Kofi froze instantly. The voices were distant, somewhere deeper in the forest. At first, he thought they might be hunters or slave patrols searching for runaways. But the voices did not sound like patrolmen. They sounded cautious, whispering. Branches moved nearby. Kofi turned slowly toward the sound, his powerful shoulders tense as he listened carefully. A figure stepped out from behind a group of trees. Then another. Then a third. They were men. Their clothes were worn and torn, and their faces showed the same wary alertness Kofi had seen in many enslaved workers before. But these men were not wearing chains. One of them held a long stick, sharpened into a spear. Another carried a small knife. They stared at Kofi in silence for several seconds. Then the tallest of the men stepped forward slowly. His eyes moved from Kofi's enormous frame down to the broken chain lying beside the fallen tree. "You came from the river," the man said quietly. Kofi nodded once. The man studied him carefully. "From a slave boat." Again, Kofi nodded. The man exchanged a glance with the others. Then he spoke words Kofi had not expected to hear. "You are not the first to escape into this forest," the man said. He gestured deeper into the trees behind him. "Come with us." Kofi remained still for a moment. The man seemed to understand the hesitation. "We are not hunters," he added quietly. "We are the ones they are hunting." Behind the man, several other figures slowly appeared among the trees. Men, women, even a few children, all watching the giant who had come out of the Mississippi River in chains. Kofi looked from one face to another. Then he realized something important. He had not escaped into an empty forest. He had found something far more powerful. A hidden community of people who had already done what he had just done. They had escaped, and together, in the darkness of the Mississippi wilderness, they had created a place where the rules of the slave markets no longer reached. The giant slave no master could transport had just discovered that he was no longer alone. Kofi remained motionless for several minutes after reaching the riverbank. The cold water of the Mississippi dripped from his body as he crouched between the thick roots of a cypress tree. The chains around his wrists and ankles clinked softly whenever he shifted his weight, but the sound was swallowed quickly by the night insects and the slow movement of the river. He listened carefully. Behind him, somewhere out on the water, the riverboat continued moving south. The distant rumble of the paddle wheels slowly faded as the boat disappeared into the darkness. The men aboard would not find him now. The forest along the river was wide and dense, filled with swamps, tangled roots, and narrow animal paths that twisted deep into the wilderness. Still, Kofi knew he could not remain where he was. The iron chains were a problem. Even though they were no longer attached to the boat, the heavy metal around his ankles slowed his movement. If slave catchers came searching along the riverbank in the morning, the tracks from those chains could easily lead them straight to him. Kofi stood slowly and stepped deeper into the forest. Each step required careful balance as the chains dragged across the ground. The mud and wet leaves muffled some of the sound, but he knew the iron would continue slowing him until he found a way to break it. The forest was thick. Tall cypress trees rose from shallow pools of dark water. Moss hung from the branches like gray curtains, and the ground beneath his feet shifted between firm soil and soft swamp. The air smelled of damp wood and river mud. Yet to Kofi, the forest felt familiar. Long before he had been forced into slavery, he had known landscapes like this. Rivers, forests, and open land were not strangers to him. The wilderness did not frighten him, the way it frightened many of the men who hunted runaways. The wilderness was alive, and it offered hiding places. After moving through the trees for nearly an hour, Kofi finally reached a small patch of higher ground, where the forest floor rose above the swamp water. There he stopped beside a fallen tree trunk and examined the chains more closely in the faint moonlight filtering through the branches. The iron cuffs were thick and tightly closed around his wrists, but the links between them had been weakened when the wooden post tore loose from the boat. Kofi picked up a heavy stone from the ground. Slowly, carefully, he raised the stone and brought it down against the chain. The first strike echoed softly through the trees. Again, he lifted the stone. Again, the metal rang against the iron links. The work was slow and exhausting, but Kofi continued striking the chain, again and again. Each blow bent the metal slightly farther, until finally one of the links cracked open. The chain around his wrists fell to the ground. For the first time since leaving the slave market, his hands were free. Kofi flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the blood returning to muscles that had been locked in iron for days. The chains around his ankles remained, but with his hands free, he now had a better chance of removing them as well. Before he could begin, however, a faint sound reached his ears. Voices. Kofi froze instantly. The voices were distant, somewhere deeper in the forest. At first, he thought they might be hunters or slave patrols searching for runaways. But the voices did not sound like patrolmen. They sounded cautious, whispering. Branches moved nearby. Kofi turned slowly toward the sound, his powerful shoulders tense as he listened carefully. A figure stepped out from behind a group of trees. Then another. Then a third. They were men. Their clothes were worn and torn, and their faces showed the same wary alertness Kofi had seen in many enslaved workers before. But these men were not wearing chains. One of them held a long stick sharpened into a spear. Another carried a small knife. They stared at Kofi in silence for several seconds. Then the tallest of the men stepped forward slowly. His eyes moved from Kofi's enormous frame down to the broken chain lying beside the fallen tree. "You came from the river," the man said quietly. Kofi nodded once. The man studied him carefully. "From a slave boat." Again, Kofi nodded. The man exchanged a glance with the others. Then he spoke words Kofi had not expected to hear. "You are not the first to escape into this forest," the man said. He gestured deeper into the trees behind him. "Come with us." Kofi remained still for a moment. The man seemed to understand the hesitation. "We are not hunters," he added quietly. "We are the ones they are hunting." Behind the man, several other figures slowly appeared among the trees. Men, women, even a few children, all watching the giant who had come out of the Mississippi River in chains. Kofi looked from one face to another. Then he realized something important. He had not escaped into an empty forest. He had found something far more powerful. A hidden community of people who had already done what he had just done. They had escaped. And together, in the darkness of the Mississippi wilderness, they had created a place where the rules of the slave markets no longer reached. The giant slave no master could transport had just discovered that he was no longer alone. The tall man with the spear studied Kofi carefully for several seconds before turning and motioning for him to follow. "Quietly," he said. The others moved silently between the trees, their steps practiced and cautious. It was clear they knew the forest well. They avoided dry branches, stepped around shallow pools of water, and used narrow paths that would be almost invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the land. Kofi followed slowly behind them. The chains around his ankles still clinked softly, but no one complained. The group understood the sound. Every one of them had once worn iron like that. As they walked deeper into the forest, the ground slowly rose, and the swamp water faded behind them. After nearly 20 minutes of moving through the trees, a faint orange glow appeared ahead through the branches. Firelight. The group approached carefully. Soon the trees opened into a small clearing hidden deep within the wilderness. Several rough shelters made from branches and mud stood beneath the tall trees. Small fires burned low in the center of the camp, while figures moved quietly between them. Men, women, children. All of them turned to look as Kofi stepped into the clearing. The camp grew silent. Even in the dim firelight, the giant's size was impossible to ignore. The broken chains still hung from his ankles, and the heavy iron cuffs on his wrists showed where he had been held. One older woman sitting near the fire slowly stood. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked up at him. "Lord have mercy," she whispered softly. "Look at the size of that man." A few of the children stared openly, half amazed and half afraid. The tall man, who had brought Kofi into the clearing, raised his hand to calm the murmurs. "He came from the river tonight," the man explained. "Escaped a transport boat." Several people nodded. Escapes from the river were rare, but not impossible. Some had tried before. Few had succeeded. The man stepped closer to Kofi. "My name is Josiah," he said. "Most of the people here came from plantations along this river. We found this place years ago, and stayed hidden ever since." Kofi looked around the camp. The shelters were simple, but they were built carefully. Food hung from ropes tied between trees. A small cooking fire burned quietly. Tools made from stone and scrap metal lay beside one of the shelters. This was not a temporary hiding place, as people had been surviving here for a long time. Josiah followed Kofi's gaze and nodded slightly. "We call this place Freedom Hollow," he said. Another man stepped forward, carrying a hammer made from a heavy piece of iron tied to a wooden handle. "Let me see those chains," the man said. Kofi extended his leg. The man crouched down beside him and examined the iron cuff around his ankle. "These came from a riverboat," the man muttered. Kofi nodded. The man raised the hammer and struck the chain with a sharp metallic crack. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the iron link split open. The chain fell away. The camp erupted into quiet smiles and relieved laughter. The second cuff took a few more strikes before it broke loose as well. When the last piece of iron dropped to the ground, Kofi stood fully free for the first time in many years. The weight that had dragged behind him since the slave market was finally gone. Josiah stepped forward and offered him a wooden cup of water. "You are safe here," he said. Kofi drank slowly, feeling the cool water wash away the taste of river mud and exhaustion. But Josiah's expression grew serious again. "For now," he added. Kofi looked up. Josiah pointed toward the dark forest beyond the clearing. "Slave catchers patrol these lands," he explained. "Plantations surround this river for miles. If they ever discover this camp, they will come with dogs and guns." The people around the fire fell silent. Everyone in the camp understood the danger. Kofi set the cup down and looked around the clearing again. Dozens of people had survived here together, hidden from the system that tried to own them. But the system was still out there, still searching, still hunting. Josiah studied Kofi's massive shoulders and powerful arms. "You are stronger than any man I have ever seen," he said quietly. Kofi said nothing. Josiah leaned closer. "If the hunters come," he continued, "this camp will need someone strong enough to help protect it." The firelight flickered across Kofi's face. For years, his strength had been used by others for profit. In the slave market, it had made him valuable. On the riverboat, it had made him dangerous. But here, in this hidden place, deep within the Mississippi forest, His strength might finally become something different. Not a burden. Not a threat, but protection. And as the giant looked around at the people gathered in Freedom Hollow, he realized something he had never known before. For the first time in his life, his strength might actually belong to him. The night in Freedom Hollow grew quieter as the fires burned low. One by one, the children were led into the shelters, and the men who had been standing guard along the edges of the clearing returned to the warmth of the flames. The forest around them remained alive, with the sounds of insects and distant animals. But inside the camp, a calm settled that Kofi had not felt in many years. He sat near the fire while Josiah and a few others spoke quietly about the river. "Did anyone follow the boat?" one of the men asked. Josiah shook his head. "The river is wide tonight. Even if they searched, the current would have carried him far from where they jumped." Another man nodded toward Kofi. "Still, if the traders lose a man that size, they will not forget about it." The group fell silent again. Everyone in the camp understood the danger. Slave traders did not easily accept losing valuable property, and Kofi's strength had made him one of the most valuable workers any plantation could hope to buy. But Kofi did not look worried. Instead, he stared into the fire as if studying the flames. The older woman who had spoken earlier approached him slowly. She carried a small wooden bowl filled with cooked corn and roots gathered from the forest. "You must eat," she said gently. "A man who fights the river will need his strength." Kofi accepted the bowl and thanked her quietly. The food was simple, but after the long night in the river and the hours of walking through the swamp, it tasted better than any meal he had eaten in years. The woman sat beside him. "My name is Ruth," she said. "I have been here longer than most." Kofi nodded respectfully. Ruth studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You are not from these lands," she said. "No," Kofi replied. "Where did they take you from?" Kofi looked up at the dark sky above the trees. "Across the ocean," he answered. Ruth nodded slowly. Many in the camp had heard stories of people taken from Africa and forced into slavery in America. Some of the older members of the camp still remembered fragments of languages and songs from those distant places. "You survived something many did not," Ruth said softly. Kofi did not respond. Instead, he listened to the quiet conversations happening around the fire. People spoke about food supplies, patrols along the river, and which paths through the forest were safest if hunters ever came searching. It was clear this community had learned to survive through careful planning. Josiah eventually stood and addressed the group. "We will keep 2 guards awake tonight," he said. "The river may hide him, but the traders will start asking questions when that boat reaches Baton Rouge." One of the younger men volunteered immediately. "I'll take the first watch." Another stood beside him. "I'll take the second." Josiah nodded. Then he looked toward Kofi again. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow we show you the paths through the forest." Kofi finished the last of the food and stood slowly. The camp was quiet now except for the crackling fire. He walked to the edge of the clearing and looked into the darkness beyond the trees. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, a maze of swamps, hills, and narrow trails known only to those who lived within it. For the first time since being captured years ago, Kofi stood without chains. The air felt different. Freedom felt different. Yet he knew this new life would not be easy. Plantations surrounded the wilderness. Slave catchers searched constantly for escaped workers, and the moment anyone discovered Freedom Hollow, the people living here would be forced to defend everything they had built. Behind him, the campfires continued burning softly. Families slept in their shelters. Children dreamed peacefully for the first time in many nights. Kofi watched the dark forest quietly. Then he spoke, almost to himself. "No one will take this place." The young guard standing nearby heard him and turned slightly. "What did you say?" the man asked. Kofi looked back toward the camp, where the people of Freedom Hollow slept. "I said," he answered calmly, "no one will take this place." The guard studied the giant for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. "Good," he said, "because if they ever try, we will need someone like you standing with us." The sound of the horses grew louder as the patrol rode along the river trail below the ridge. Dust rose behind them as the riders pushed their animals forward, scanning the banks of the Mississippi for any sign of a man who might have escaped during the night. Even from a distance, Kofi could see their rifles resting across their saddles and the long ropes tied behind them. Slave catchers. They had followed the river from Natchez, and now they were searching every stretch of shoreline where a swimmer might have reached land. Josiah crouched beside a fallen log and watched them carefully. "There are 5 of them," he whispered. Kofi nodded. The riders slowed their horses as they reached the shallow bend where swimmers often tried to reach shore. One of the men dismounted and began examining the muddy ground near the water. Kofi knew what the man was looking for. Tracks. Footprints. Any sign that someone had climbed from the river during the night. The man studied the ground for a moment, and then suddenly raised his hand. The other riders gathered around him. Even from the ridge, Kofi could see the shape of the footprints pressed into the wet mud. The patrol had found the place where he had crawled from the water. Josiah's face tightened. "They have the trail," he said quietly. Below them, the riders began following the footprints into the trees. The broken marks left by the iron chains dragging across the ground made the trail even easier to see. The patrol moved slowly now, leading their horses while watching the forest ahead. They were coming directly toward the ridge, toward Freedom Hollow. Josiah turned quickly. "I need to warn the others," he said. But Kofi stepped forward. "No." Josiah stared at him. "If we move the camp now, they will see the tracks of everyone leaving," Kofi explained calmly. "Then they will know many people are hiding here." Josiah hesitated. The giant was right. A sudden movement of 30 people through the forest would leave clear signs for the hunters. Kofi looked down toward the approaching riders again. "They are following one trail," he said. "Mine." Josiah understood. "You want to lead them away?" Kofi nodded once. "It is the only way." Josiah looked at the giant's broad shoulders and powerful arms. The man who had frightened slave traders and plantation owners now stood ready to risk everything again. "For people you met only a few hours ago," Josiah said quietly. Kofi did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the hidden camp. "I know what it means to live in chains," he said finally. Then he turned toward the forest on the opposite side of the ridge. "Tell your people to stay hidden." Before Josiah could say another word, Kofi began moving down the slope. He did not try to hide his tracks this time. Instead, he stepped heavily through the mud, making sure the patrol could easily follow his path. Within minutes, the riders reached the place where he had climbed from the river. One of the men pointed deeper into the forest, where Kofi's fresh footprints led away. "There he is," the man shouted. The patrol mounted their horses again and began riding quickly along the trail Kofi had left. From the ridge, Josiah watched the giant disappear deeper into the forest. The riders followed only seconds behind. Branches snapped as the horses pushed through the undergrowth, chasing the massive figure moving ahead of them. Kofi ran through the trees with powerful strides. Even without chains, his steps shook the forest floor as he moved. The riders shouted behind him, urging their horses forward. But the forest was thick, and Kofi knew something the patrol did not. He was not running blindly. He was running toward the swamp. Within minutes, the ground began turning softer beneath his feet. Water pooled between the trees, and the path narrowed into thick marshland, where horses could not move easily. Behind him, the riders slowed. The swamp swallowed the trail. Horses struggled to move through the muddy water. Kofi continued forward. Soon the trees closed around him, and the sounds of the patrol faded behind the thick walls of swamp and forest. Back on the ridge, Josiah finally allowed himself to breathe again. The riders had taken the bait. Freedom Hollow remained hidden, and somewhere deep in the Mississippi swamp, the giant slave no master could transport had once again vanished into the wilderness. But now, the hunters knew something they had not known before. The man they were chasing was not just strong. He was clever, and the next time the patrol returned to the river looking for him, they would be entering a forest where Kofi now knew every path. The patrol searched the swamp for hours. Their horses struggled through the thick mud and shallow water, while the men shouted directions to one another. From time to time, they found broken branches or faint footprints where Kofi had passed. But the deeper they moved into the swamp, the more the trail disappeared. The Mississippi wilderness was not friendly to outsiders. Water covered the ground in many places, washing away tracks within minutes. Tall reeds and thick roots twisted covered the ground in many places, washing away tracks within minutes. Tall reeds and thick roots twisted across the land, creating paths that changed with every step. By midday, the riders were exhausted, their horses slowing beneath the heat and the weight of the journey. One of the men finally pulled his horse to a stop. "This is useless," he muttered. Another rider wiped sweat from his face and looked around at the endless swamp. That giant could be anywhere now. They searched for a while longer, but the forest refused to give them what they wanted. Eventually, the patrol turned their horses back toward the river. The man they had chased from Natchez had vanished completely, and they would never see him again. Deep within the forest, far beyond the reach of the riders, Kofi moved slowly through the swamp until the sounds of the patrol disappeared entirely. Only then did he stop. The giant stood quietly beside a cluster of trees, listening to the distant calls of birds and the quiet movement of water through the marsh. The danger had passed for now. When the sun began lowering toward the horizon, Kofi finally turned back toward the hidden paths that led to Freedom Hollow. The people in the camp were waiting. When he stepped into the clearing again, a cheer rose among them. Josiah rushed forward first, relief clear in his face. "You led them far away," Josiah said. Kofi nodded. "They will search other places now." Ruth smiled softly as she handed him a cup of water. "You protected this place," she said. Kofi looked around the camp. Children were laughing again near the fire. Families moved freely through the clearing without fear of chains or overseers. The hidden community had survived another day. For years, his strength had been used by others. In the slave markets, it had made him valuable. On plantations, it had made him a tool for labor. On the riverboat, it had made him a prisoner chained to iron. But here in Freedom Hollow, his strength had become something different. It had become protection. In the weeks that followed, Kofi helped the community grow stronger. He cleared new paths through the forest, helped build stronger shelters, and trained others how to move quietly through the swamp if patrols ever returned. Word slowly spread among escaped slaves traveling along the river. There was a place deep in the Mississippi wilderness where people lived free. A place protected by the forest and guarded by a giant man who had once terrified the slave markets of the South. No one could transport him. No master could control him. And no patrol ever managed to capture him again. Some travelers who passed along the Mississippi years later spoke quietly about a hidden settlement deep in the swamp. They said a towering man watched over the camp, a man who moved through the forest like a shadow and protected anyone who reached that place seeking freedom. Whether those stories were fully true or grew larger through time, one thing remained certain. The giant slave the traders once struggled to sell had become something they never expected. Not property, not cargo, but a guardian of freedom. And somewhere deep in the forests, along the Mississippi River, the legend of Kofi continued to grow long after the slave markets that once tried to own him had faded into history. That is the kind of forgotten story we uncover here on Shadow of Black History, where the voices and courage of those nearly erased from history are finally brought back into the light. Because sometimes the people history tried to silence become the very legends it can never forget.